I think a case for cooperatives can be made in all different types of cooperatives, predominantly consumer and worker, seeing as they have very positive economic results in terms of, for example, employee turnover rate, raising wages, productivity, and other things like that. In America alone, one of the largest cooperatives is called CHCA, which again has a 15% employee turnover rate compared to the industry standard, which is obviously it's a type of healthcare cooperative. And the average, and this is lowballing, it is about 40%. So I think it's safe to say that with a variety of these different types of businesses, the American economy can thrive. And there's certain policies and legislation I'd like to have passed, as well as both in America and Canada, where I'm from, that could potentially help bolster the economy, democratize it, and help other people in a variety of ways. One policy I'd like to introduce is, for example, I'd like to actually have a policy implemented in the 4 largest urban centers in Canada, being Montreal, Vancouver, Toronto, and Calgary, which have also the highest wealth inequality rates, because I'm sure you'd agree with me that wealth inequality is a bad thing, where we would introduce municipal credit unions, and as a result, these would help democratize banking in those large areas and create a social dividend, which people have access to, and helps lower wealth inequality like that. There's also a variety of data worldwide that helps contribute to the cause for worker cooperatives. And I think that worker cooperatives have more sufficient data on a global scale as opposed to an American-centric scale, which is why, at least in the US, I think the data from cooperatives as well as ESOPs to show correlations between worker productivity and the data related to how it actually helps people can, in terms of A, productivity rates, and B, improving their lives and, for example, health standards, because this does have an impact on physical health standards, help me make my case. And with that, I'll turn it over to Econo Boy.
Yeah, sure. So I guess my case for the reason I would call myself a capitalist, really, I think that reformist market socialists and social democrats tend to not to disagree very much on the prescriptions for the first half, let's say. It's really just about where that finish line is, and I suppose also what we might call the finish line. From certain socialist persuasions, I think more aligned with yourself, the idea of just collective ownership as a means by which socialism can be achieved, or at least that road to maybe full-on socialism or communism can be achieved, can be through these incentive programs or generally encouraging consumer or worker cooperatives, and that's through government policy and perhaps through social wealth funds and things like that. I think that the issue with worker cooperatives and incentives isn't that they don't necessarily work, and it's not that I don't actually believe in them. It's that I don't think they work to the scale by which you'd actually expect the bulk or a substantial portion of the economy to be, cooperatively run. I think that that's the issue that those incentives come into form with, that they frankly just wouldn't work. And if we subsidized certain businesses over others to such a significant degree that it would almost force the economy to be more cooperatively run, I think that's where you get into problems with inefficient allocation of capital, overinvestment in industries, which has plagued pretty much every socialist society. And I'm not sure that that's a society also that's necessarily better for the workers. That's kind of where I'm coming. That's where I'm coming from in terms of this conversation. And I'm looking forward to getting into it. Let's do it.
All right.
Yeah, for
So,
sure.
open discussion until time allows or until we reach a conclusion. And then probably, I guess, in about like an hour and a half, I'll move to opening statement or closing statements, rather.
Alrighty.
Yeah, so I guess with a large part of my point, there's going to have to...
Oh, no. Did he...
So
maybe...
Are you okay working with when we're talking about worker co-ops exclusively? Because I do like to use consumer co-ops, and you've had a discussion with someone who's actually quite similar to me on this. You've spoken with Synth before. I've seen that. So
yeah,
I play somewhere similarly to them. So in relation to how I define socialism and how socialism was defined academically, the term itself was actually coined by the early utopian socialist philosophers, being, Henri de Saint-Simon, Robert Owen, Charles Fourier, etc.
I get that. I'm not dismissing your definition of socialism as just collective ownership, right? I'm really more so saying that the mechanisms by which we might achieve quote unquote collective ownership to such an extent that we would consider it socialist or mostly socialist, I'm not sure would actually be quite as effective as you might assume.
So the thing with that is I think a lot about this in terms of collective finance as well, right? So you brought up sovereign wealth funds earlier. I think those are a great way of generating wealth for people, especially average people. Obviously, there's been talks of the one in Norway. There's some that have been run in China, which
Yeah,
generally do a good job providing stimulus to people in those
there's
economies.
many
Not
examples of social wealth
right.
funds,
Yeah.
even in
Another thing I'd
America,
like to get into, yeah, exactly. Albeit the ones in America are much, much smaller than, for example, the
yeah,
Norwegian and Chinese ones. So
and they're local.
yeah, for example, there's one in Oregon based around like school education stuff, right?
Yeah,
That one only has about 76 billion as opposed to Norway's, which has over a trillion 1.3 trillion dollars invested into it. So, there's I wouldn't be getting into such superficial stuff like that because I think that that doesn't really help me prove my point. One thing with economies of scale that I want to talk about is consumer co-ops as well as finance, right? I mentioned it in my opening statement, but I myself am from Canada, so we have a
wow,
predominant finance sector. I know it's a really
can't believe it. Can't
terrible
believe
burden. I know.
it's a good thing you didn't mention that before this debate because I don't talk to your kind, okay? I wouldn't have even accepted the debate if I knew that.
I had to
What can I say?
manipulate you into it.
I have to. That's what the mask is. So, carrying on from there, a large sector of our finances is done in credit unions. Credit unions are predominantly run as obviously consumer cooperatives, right? They do a great job of generating wealth for the people involved with them. They produce social dividends, and they're often used to invest in the community surrounding them. So, a program I would talk about instituting, like I did in my opening statement, is again, one, we're the largest municipalities in Canada, which shows that, again, they have really disproportionate wealth inequality in these urban areas compared to the rest of the nation. They would actually implement some kind of policy to, whether it be in relation to tax cuts for specific zoning measures or government subsidies or, municipal, for example, property tax cuts, things like that. These kind of things would help bolster a credit union enterprise to exist in these larger urban areas. Now, with credit unions, there's actually a bunch of benefits to them. For example, on average in Canada, they generate 9% of their revenue,
Yep.
or
Well,
9% growth in revenue, right? So I
really,
think these are good things.
well, yeah, no, but let me jump in here. So again, I'm not against credit unions, right? I'm not even necessarily against some maybe government incentives to encourage them. It sounds like what you're talking about are basically municipally sponsored credit unions, kind of like almost like a non-government entity or something like that. But they're credit unions and they're local. I mean, I get that, right? That's not necessarily a bad idea. I think that the issue that you're running into is that you have to be able to demonstrate from A, B to C that we do this program and it somehow creates a broad collectivization of ownership. And I think that that's where the almost you could call it like hyper reformist socialists kind of fall short with regard to the different types of incentives that they would offer. Where on one hand, the incentives might not be significant enough to achieve collective ownership, but on the other hand, they might be so significant they might actually result in an inefficient allocation of capital. This is the balance that you would need to strike to convince me.
Right. So the thing with that is when we're talking about credit unions, I want to quickly touch on why these help with collective ownership over the quote unquote means of production, right? So when I'm talking about a lot of how traditional banking is ran in comparison to credit unions, this is an effective way because I think a core component of having an effectively ran socialist economy is democratizing that. So this is one of those things that allows people to do that. It also allows workers access to ownership within a lot of credit unions. Again, have easy access for employees to become members. It's open and free, which is, part of a traditionally considered cooperative structure, right? It's fairly easy to gain involvement through a membership or through holding an account, etc. So with that, I'm more or less trying to touch on the democratization of the economy in the sense that that would help bolster socialist policy and things like that. The data on it's also pretty conclusive as far as what it goes. So I think a policy like this would be a no-brainer.
Yeah.
With credit unions in terms of how they're consumer cooperatives, right? We do see that collectivization of finance because that's generally how it plays out in terms of whether it creates some kind of stimulus through a UBI with the social dividend that it's providing, as well as a lot of internal investments into community structures. Another thing that I think would be a good thing for credit unions to get involved with, or the government to get involved with, is, for example, having credit unions be involved with the stock market itself. So what we could do is, for example, they would use some of the excess revenue. The government might match it, or maybe not match it, match 50% of it, a quarter of it, depending on how much wealth they generate, right, through their revenue, which, a lot of credit unions are generally nonprofit organizations. So
Yeah,
what we'd have here is a social dividend, right, which we could choose and use to invest in businesses that are surrounding, the rest of, for example, the local community. Like, I'll just provide an example really quick. For a long, long time, there was a factory near where I lived. It was a Heinz factory, right? So they did the ketchup, all of that, and it employed a lot of people within the community. It employed over 4,000 people locally. So with that community having about 35,000 people who lived there, and a lot of the jobs being relation to Heinz, I think that, um, for example, these credit unions could use some of that social dividend, or that, at least that excess revenue, I'll call it for now, um, to invest in a Heinz, buy stock shares, and then effectively democratize parts of Heinz by having a voter membership and, becoming a shareholder, whether it acts, within the interest of the people who work at that credit union or something like that.
yeah. So yeah, again, but I think for each of these things, I'm gonna have to repeat myself or repeat the question. Right? Is that I can agree that municipal financing can probably be a good thing. Perhaps some encouragement of local credit unions is a good thing. We have a lot of local credit unions in America. I think the issue is twofold. One is that we can agree that credit unions are good, and we can agree that in instances where credit unions have existed or have come into being, have been positive for their local communities, or just positive generally, and perhaps competitive on the local market. However, they still have problems internally, and at the same time, micro examples of positive outcomes probably aren't a justification for a macro implementation of these types of systems. And I think that additionally, when you're talking about credit unions specifically, you'd have to also demonstrate that credit unions are able to compete at scale equivalent to the largest multinational banks in society, or at the very least not compete, but at the very least offer services unique that other larger banks wouldn't be able to offer. In general, I think that that's the struggle that you might have in this debate.
Yeah. So, well, the thing with that is, actually there is, for example, a lot of the data I'm sourcing is of scale in terms of, like, for example, how credit unions operate. Like, one of the predominant in, I'm not sure if you've seen any of the studies or the surveys that have come out of Poland, but actually, I believe it's 10% of all assets in Poland, in the sector of, like, the finance sector, are actually held by credit union or consumer cooperatively ran financing institutions. So we can see that with the information that we get from these places, it does apply on an economy to scale level. Also, the reason I'm talking about consumer co-ops is because they do generally tend to, and this is the reason I'm using them over worker cooperatives. There might be a problem with worker cooperatives where we don't have sufficient data on them to determine whether they would be practically implemented in a sort of economy of scale sense. But with credit unions and consumer co-ops alike, right? For example, 92% of the cooperative sector in the United States is in fact consumer co-ops. So I've heard you previously mention in debates, right, that you think about things like, for example, producer cooperatives. Well, the largest part of the cooperative sector in the United States is actually consumer cooperatives, right, which do a good job of proliferating that collective wealth. So
Yeah,
this isn't just going into the hands of a few people. This is active efforts to collectivize the economy, which is kind of what I'm trying to get at with you here.
no, I understand, but again, like as a social democrat and as someone who's like, I think anyone generally on the left, whether they be a left capitalist or a left socialist, would say that some collectivization or some even nationalization wouldn't necessarily be the worst thing in the world, right? Again, I'm not against incentivizing these types of structures, and I'm not against necessarily nationalizing certain markets that prove incredibly inefficient. For instance, I advocate for single-payer healthcare, which is, you could call that a collectivization of industry, whatever. I would call it a nationalization, might be a little bit more specific, but the point is that's a little bit irrelevant. I would just say that in general, the types of structures you're advocating for are not bad. It's just a matter of, can they actually make it all the way, in in a way in which is organic to a mostly socialist or cooperatively organized society. And I'm very skeptical of that. You mentioned Poland, that 10% of all assets are controlled by a cooperative credit union or something similar to that sort of structure. And my argument to that would be that, well, it's only 10%, right? And perhaps a world where 10% of assets are controlled by credit unions is better than a world where, only 2% of assets are controlled by credit unions. But a world with only 10% collectivization of finance is certainly not a world that I would call socialist, right?
Well, absolutely not, and I completely agree with you on that. But when I'm trying to prove my point here, and I guess it's coming off like you don't have a huge problem with this type of enterprise. But what I am saying here is that between sovereign wealth fund efforts and things like that, we can actually achieve a more collectivized economy to the point of where, at least, because one thing I pride myself on is active efforts to lower the Gini coefficient. Right, historically, I can come up with socialist examples. Like, I'm not sure if you see the flag sitting behind me over there, but
I do.
generally I lean into a little bit of the Yugoslavian politics here, right? I see that smirk on Rinyald's face. He knows this is like my trap card, so to speak, right? But when we're also talking about economies of scale, right? Yugoslavia actually did function as a predominantly worker cooperative based economy. They had a very effective economy for the time too. And these are the kind of collectivization efforts I seek when I'm looking at an economy. They had state managed credit union finances, which I'm not saying is, again, a really drastic, that's kind of a very drastic forward effort. But also in relation to where they were historically, they were a revolutionary society. So I think reformist policies are the ones that tend to be more pragmatic in American politics today, right? So
Yeah,
the
yeah,
ends I'm
but
seeking are ones are comparable to that, right? I hope you understand that as much. And the efforts I'm making towards progressing towards a collective economy are based around the idea that so much in assets, because one thing I care about is that we lower wealth inequality through distribution of assets, which I'm sure you don't really entirely disagree with as a sock down. And another thing I care about is active efforts to collectivize and democratize the workplace, because it seems to be beneficial in its correlations with health outcomes and worker happiness and productivity, right? Its correlation with ownership is very
yeah.
strong. You understand that. You've seen the studies on ESOPs. I can
No,
talk about the
yeah.
economy of Yugoslavia if you need me to, because I've done quite a fair bit of research into that. The way they ran their economy was very fruitful, especially considering they were one of the bottom 100 countries globally in terms of how their economy was ran. And then once they started industrializing throughout the 60s, the 70s, the 80s, they adopted more of a liberal sort of democratic framework, especially within their economy. They had worker self-management. They had a lot of those principles. And they drastically lowered wealth inequality. They managed to bolster their economy up to the top 25 strongest in the world, at least in terms of gross national product overall. And that's especially impressive compared with their relatively low population for the time. Then they went through all of these other crises, and one of the things that ultimately collapsed their economy was like oil crisis, which is something that wouldn't particularly be helped in a capitalist society. There's arguments I can make that you would agree with me on, for example, pertaining to liberal trade and how that benefits economies, right? So if I have to reference that, I can. If you want to talk about cooperative data, we can as well. I think you understand my point, though, is a more broad push towards this collective effort in the economy.
Yeah, I understand, and it also would depend on your definition of socialism. Like Synth pretty squarely said, well, I think you're just a socialist to me, right? And to which, of course, I disagree. I'm not sure socialism is necessarily I'm not sure socialism is necessarily just collective ownership. I think that by that understanding, Norway would be a mostly socialist economy, and I'm not sure most people would say that it is. I would just say that capitalism to me is when there's private investment that has meaningful decision making capacity. To me, that's what capitalism is. It's capital investment that confers ownership and decision making capacity. Now, obviously, there's scales there, right? If you only had like 2% of your economy where this was allowed, could you call that capitalist? Probably not. And at the same time, would you call a situation like the Chinese government? Would you call that socialism? To be fair, under your definition, you might actually call that socialism because it's a relatively.
I would with the Chinese. Yeah, I would with the Chinese government, considering 55% of the assets in the economy are actually owned by the state, right?
Yeah,
Plus,
no,
pretty much
that's
100% are managed by the state. So it does
that's what
fit
I'm.
within that collective definition, right? Because it's considered state socialism more broadly.
No, I understand what you're saying. I would just say that I'm not sure how relevant necessarily the definition is. I would just say prescriptively, I think that there's some areas where I think that your goal kind of falls short with the prescriptions that you're advocating for. So, and this is again an issue that I think you haven't really necessarily answered. We can all agree on certain select incentivization programs, and we can agree on certain reforms that might make our economy more collectivized, right? I mentioned, oh, give me one second, gotta plug this in. I mentioned a single payer healthcare system. I mentioned incentivization of co-ops. I mentioned worker board membership. I mentioned all of these things that are democratizing the workplace or collectivizing certain industry or certain workplaces. But I don't think that under that framework I would call it socialism because a majority of the economy still isn't sort of collectively controlled. And I think that under your system you wouldn't get there in the first place necessarily. And I think that the types of things you might advocate for in order to get to like majority collective ownership would probably be detrimental to the economy overall, detrimental ultimately to the workers.
So, I would have to push back on that. In which way do you think that the policies I've advocated for thus far have been detrimental or would be detrimental to the working class? Because we're not
So
talking about a complete overhaul of the system in the sense that I want
yeah,
100% mandated cooperative businesses. Again, I saw your debate with the Vosh the other day. I thought that was a fairly stupid point because that's non-pragmatic. It's not effective. That's, again, what I'm advocating for is a change in, because we have this dichotomy between socialism and capitalism, where capitalism to me, or at least as I perceive it, revolves around the notion of private ownership over the means of production. Well, I would advocate, and what I've been trying to consistently advocate for here is a shift. Sorry, is a shift to a more dominant collective ownership over the means of production, right? So we can do this, and this might not entail 100% or even like 70% worker co-op economy. This might entail 20% of assets controlled by the state or monetary. For example, we'd increase taxes. We would have a higher progressive tax rate in which some of that money would get invested in a sovereign wealth fund, which would be I don't know, approximately 15% of state controlled assets, 20% of state controlled assets. So they have all these investments in foreign and domestic, because I don't entirely agree with the fact that Norway doesn't invest into their local economy in regards to their sovereign wealth fund. But we have
yeah.
these foreign investments
Well,
in
they
bonds,
do though.
stocks, other things, right? It's relatively limited between the two. I'm more dominantly talking about I believe it's the oil
I mean,
pension fund.
a
It's the
third
one
of
that
a third of the domestic equity market is owned either by the pension fund or is owned either by the pension fund or in state-owned enterprises. So I mean, Norway does have a seriously broad amount of, you could say, collective ownership, but basically state ownership and investment in the stocks.
They do more generally speaking for that part, but as far as I understand, most of the investments do go foreign. I think it's very like dominantly
Yeah.
invested.
Well, most of the
Across borders
investments
and things like that, right?
most of the investments in their global social wealth fund are foreign investments, but most of the investments in the in the Norway social wealth fund are domestic. I think only 15% of that wealth fund is invested in foreign assets, and it's because they're allowed to invest in Nordic assets. So 15% of it is invest in like assets in like Sweden and Finland and Iceland, and maybe Denmark. But then 85% of it is focused domestically. And to be
Do
fair,
not.
that makes logistical sense because if the Norwegian Global Wealth Fund invested in only domestic assets, you'd literally end up buying like the whole entire economy of Norway or some shit, right? You'd end up with a
Yeah, no,
lot of
I
structural problems.
understand that for sure. So the thing I'm trying to get at here, though, is I believe it was the pension fund, which is the larger of the two, wealth funds, correct?
They're both called pension funds, but one of them is
Is
yeah.
predominantly
Well,
investing in oil,
they
right?
they have a confusing naming convention because it's called
Yeah.
like Norway Pension Fund Global, which is the big giant daddy fund, the $1 trillion fund,
Mhm.
and then there's the Norway Pension Fund Norway, which is the few $100 billion domestic focused fund.
Right. Yeah. So
So
that's what I was trying to get at. The global one tends to be the larger of the two, which is why I'm referencing this one because most of its investments tend to be in global assets as opposed to domestic. Now, I believe
sure.
you said it was 85% of the other one is domestic or invested domestically.
Yeah, 85% of it, and in combination with their state-owned enterprises and their domestic pension fund, they end up controlling about a third of the stock market. Now, to be fair, though, that is just the stock market. Like, I'm not including private businesses in that regard.
Right.
Like,
And
only
that's not just all asset, or that's not like close to, say, half of the assets, which would kind of, to me, seems to be the threshold for a shift in the dichotomy.
well, sure, but at that point, your definition probably has to be a little bit more nuanced because I think like I think like 30 or 40% of Norwegians work for the state, right? The government spending is a majority of the GDP of Norway. Tax receipts alone are like 40%. So, I mean, I think you can make a really convincing argument that actually, under your definition, Norway would be considered a socialist economy.
I mean, you could probably make that argument. My contentions with that would probably be surrounding the amount of, for example, like you said, private businesses and pertaining to how that's not controlled in the stock market, which means they're not publicly traded, things like that, which kind of disallows the employees or the working class to have more investment into that aspect of the economy, kind of dissuades from the collective ownership over the means of production aspect. A lot of it is invested throughout the state and within the state, which I think is an important part of that as well, which is one of the core components for what I'm trying to advocate for when I talk about a collectivization of the economy. Right.
Well, but really, can I ask you a
there's going to
question?
be yeah, for sure.
So I feel like I really disagree with this premise, though, because I feel like if you're operating under a democratic government, Norway is one of the most open and transparent democracies in the world, right? So we probably wouldn't say that Norway is not like a robustly democratic society. If you're operating under a democratic framework and 40% of the economy is collected and redistributed in taxes, I don't really understand how that's not necessarily that seems like a necessary sort of collectivization of the economy, right? You are collectivizing 40% of the economy and redistributing it as you see fit, right? That already makes you so incredibly close to what I would consider socialism under your framework, not necessarily under my framework. I absolutely would not consider Norway a socialist country, but under yours, I feel like you really would consider it a socialist country.
I mean, it's definitely getting there for me, which is one of the like benefits. And of course, we see all these positive outcomes in Norway, right? Because I'm not looking at this from like a Marxian perspective in terms of how I'm defining socialism here, right? Because I
Yeah,
think you can tell that that's not
yeah.
the aim of the game for me here.
No, I understand.
Another thing I wanted to touch on is because I tried my best to answer the question you asked me earlier. I just want to know what policy prescriptions you disagree with the ones I've laid out so far are. It doesn't
So,
seem like you have too many disagreements with me in terms of what I've been saying.
well, no, again, and this is where like there's a different kind of clash when a Stockton is talking to like a relatively reformist market socialist, which is that we can probably agree on a lot of prescriptions, right? Like so, like the idea of like municipally sponsored credit unions, I think makes a lot of sense. Incentivizing worker cooperatives in our DMs, I'm sure you won't mind me saying. You mentioned the idea of getting rid of oil subsidies and putting those in some sort of almost like a fund just to encourage cooperative ownership, right? So like stuff like that isn't anything that I think that I would necessarily disagree with. It's really just a matter of not only the scale of the investment, how inefficient that investment might be if it's too big of a scale, if it's too generous a subsidy, but also the idea that, well, if we pull back the subsidies to a degree in which to a degree by which they're efficient and they lead to a more organic transformation of the economy where consumer and worker cooperatives end up sorting themselves in parts of the economy that are most advantageous for themselves, I think we've actually run that experiment before on a global scale. And I think that what that experiment has shown is that cooperative ownership doesn't do as well in all industries as it does in select industries. And I think that when that model is sort of attempted in terms of incentivization and whatnot, you end up having, 10% of the economy be cooperatively owned or 5% or 10% of employment or something like that. Not anywhere
Well, as it
close.
currently exists, America is already approximately 10% cooperatively owned, right? So
Well, sure. It depends on how you would define cooperative ownership, and I think that I'd be interested to see what the statistic that you're citing there, and I'd be interested to see if it includes producer cooperatives. But in general,
it
though,
does include producer co-ops, but one thing before you continue. In regards to producer co-ops, they do not make up a significant portion of the cooperatives anyways. There are about approximately as many producer co-ops as there are worker co-ops. They're within 1 or 2% of all total co-ops. I'm including purchasing as well because I think those are a good way of actually sort of having a large investment of funds. And when we're talking about producer co-ops too, majority of producer co-ops can be very small. Now, there's not many of them. However, I think it's important to note that when we see these smaller producer cooperatives, right, it's generally an investment of funds to a group of, say, small scale artisans or things like that. Just because there's a few large producer co-ops like Ocean Spray, for example, I don't think can completely discount that, but I'm not even going to touch on that too much because
well, I think
producer co-ops don't make my point with me or for me as
yeah.
much as I'm trying to push off here, right?
Well,
I'm trying to get the point across that consumer co-ops seem to be a very effective way of going about collectivizing the economy. Another thing that's important to touch on with consumer co-ops, like I said, especially within the finance sector. And another thing I have a disagreement on with you is, at least in North America and the West today, the way that industry is dispersed among cooperative ownership types is actually a little more dispersed than you think it is, right? So it's not just predominantly in agriculture. A lot of it's, I think a third of it's in the service economy itself in a variety of different ways. There's also, again, manufacturing. Like, for example, there's a sector of northeastern, or no, is it northwestern? My bad.
Well, wait, but
Wood
I feel
manufacturing
like
plants and co-ops, right? And
yeah, I
they're
feel
6 to
like
14% more
1 second,
productive.
Dylan. 1 second, Dylan.
well,
Yeah,
I
for
feel like
sure. Go ahead.
I feel like you're still not answering the question though. So the question this entire debate has been, do you think that those incentives would lead to a mostly collectivized economy? I would say no. You might say yes to that, but my response to that would be that if your answer is yes, I think you're almost necessarily getting into the realm of inefficient allocation of capital generally that wouldn't be as good for the workers as the types of systems that I would advocate for. You're focusing on cooperatives, but if your big thing is just democratized industry or collectivized decision making, you'd advocate for like worker board membership as a way more efficient way to do that, or even unionization, right? Sort of the collective
Right,
decision
right.
making, right? But well, hold
So
on,
things
just I
Okay,
have
yeah,
one
for
more
sure.
one more thing to say. Where it's just to say that I think you have to contend with that, and we have to go from there because I think throughout this debate frankly, I just don't think you've answered that question.
So I've tried to answer that in as many ways as possible. When we're talking about the allocation of resources itself, though, I think it's important to kind of push back on the fact that I'm not excluding other factors, right? Like, I'm not excluding ESOPs as an effective form of actually collectivizing assets throughout the economy. They tend to do a very good job of that, which is sort of in part why I wanted to show the correlation. Now, when it comes to democratizing workplaces and things like that, effectively, in my opinion, when you have a democratized control of that, it effectively gives the collective ownership over, or that power over, to workers. So I think that it's realistic and achievable among unions, ESOPs, collective ownership, pushing for co-ops, things like that. Those subsidies, as well as sovereign wealth funds, a single-payer health plan, other things like that, do create a more collectivized economy than I think you have the idea of existing here. We're
Well,
already
I
at
don't know.
10% of the economic assets being owned in co-ops. If we can get that up to 20 to 25%, invest in a larger sovereign wealth fund on a federal level, as well as have single-payer healthcare, and on top of that, we have ESOPs which distribute ownership throughout the economy to people in the form of stocks, right? And ownership over the firms they work at, because these are really effective at increasing productivity among employees. Government can offer incentives to make that work. And now we've pushed for a collective economy. So this is the kind of thing I'm talking about here, right? That seems realistic to me. I don't understand which notion of that you disagree with. And I don't think that I'm not sure if you're putting too much weight onto just co-ops receiving X amount of resources to the point of where it becomes inefficient, when all of these other programs contribute to the overall collectivization of the economy at large.
I understand what you're saying. I think what I would use as an example might be that region of northern Italy with all of these different incentives for cooperative ownership. And what you find with pretty incredibly generous subsidization, pretty generous resource allocation from the governments and education programs and sort of research and technological grants and stuff like that. What you find is you don't end up seeing a incredible large amount of cooperative ownership as a percentage of like employment or as a percentage of businesses, right? And I think that and that's not to mention that most of the cooperatives in that regard are producer cooperatives. Now, one thing with studying cooperatives is that every region is different. It also depends on when you take the sampling of the data, and it also depends on the types of industries that you're looking at. But in general, I think that this is a pretty decent test case for like what would like heavy incentivization of cooperatives look like. And I think what it looks like is probably around 5 to 10% of the economy being like cooperatively organized. You mentioned that 10% of the economy is cooperatively organized today. To be fair, I'm not sure what statistic you're referencing. You mentioned that it actually doesn't
I'll
include
link
that
that
many.
to you.
Yeah,
I'll
yeah,
link
link
that
it.
to you, and it's about 3% producer co-ops.
Okay, well,
92% are consumer.
yeah, sure. And I think the question, you say 10% of the entire economy. I guess the question would be, what does entire economy mean? But that's kind of beside the point, right? I think the point would be that I'm not sure that these incentives would necessarily get you all the way there. And if you're talking about like just making up the difference with the social wealth fund, getting like 20, 30% of the economy owned under a social wealth fund. I think you're talking about, like, again, probably that inefficient allocation of capital, local knowledge problems, economic calculation problem, like whatever might have you be, basically inefficient allocation of capital on the part of the government investing in businesses. In general, I think that that would be a problem. And I'm not sure that that system is distinctly advantageous relative to the system of, incentivizing cooperative ownership with, less generously probably than you would, while also engaging in things that would encourage unionization, worker board membership, and generally more, generally more generous sort of government welfare programs.
So, just one thing before we continue from there. You were talking about Emilia Romagna, right? Being the part of Italy, correct?
Yeah, pretty much.
Yeah, so I think it's important to note that 30% of the region's GDP is produced by cooperative or parts of the cooperative economy. And I know you're going to say 10% of these people are employed there. However, it's important to note that 66% of the people who live there are members of these co-ops. So that's kind of plays into my consumer cooperative aspect of this. And there is
Yeah,
a
but
large
most yeah, yeah.
consumer co-op sector too.
I
Another
think
thing is,
there's a big
Wait,
difference
yeah.
though. I think there's a big difference between being a member of a cooperative and the actual production, like the productive capabilities of your economy being collectively organized. Now, what I would challenge you to do, and this is a challenge I give to you because I was not able to meet this challenge, was actually source that statistic of 30% GDP, because I found that exact same statistic, and what I found was that I can't source it. I don't know where it comes from. Right. I know that it was said to have come from a specific professor, but I'm not able to find a book. I'm not able to find an article. I'm not able to find some analysis he did. I just can't source it. And maybe I need to appeal to a larger audience to find that source. I'm not able to find it. But in general, let's
here, I
just
can
say,
drop it in chat.
well, but are you dropping to me an article written by someone who's citing him, or the actual citation itself? That's what I'm not able to source. The original, like,
Okay, well, you
where does that
article, so I wasn't sure what you're referring to.
No. So like where that number of 30%,
Yeah.
I'm not able to find where that originally comes from, right? Now, let's just say that that number is completely accurate. What you have to contend with at that point is that that is overwhelmingly producer cooperatives that are producing that number. It's a heavily agricultural region. And those are all, heavily producer cooperatives. I imagine the 3% of producer cooperatives that you reference in regard to that 10% of the economy are probably also overwhelmingly agricultural cooperatives as well. And so it's just, I think there's serious, and this is a region with heavy incentivization for cooperative organization. I think that there are serious concerns with regard to the idea that these incentives can actually form a collectivized economy. By that regard, with 67% of people being members of cooperatives, either social cooperatives, consumer cooperatives, what have you, would you call this a socialist region of the world? I would not, because the actual output and actual ownership and actual employment is not actually majorly collectivized. That's sort of the issue we're running into.
Right, not the majority of
Wait,
the economy.
real
Yeah,
quick.
sorry, go ahead, Winiel.
Dylan, just whenever you're not talking, sometimes when you're breathing, you're hot micing into your mouth or into your mic. I just wanted to let you know that, like, when you're not talking, could you back away from the mic just a little bit?
Yeah, for sure.
Okay, I
Sorry,
appreciate it.
I don't have the audio playing through my
No, yeah, I
headphones.
gotcha. Yep.
Yeah, okay. So I think it's important to note that, do you have any statistics on the percentage of co-ops that are in this region of Italy that are actually a producer? Because I'm not able to find any sources on the actual percentage of how the
Yeah.
co-ops are distributed, right?
Yeah, I can send you my I have like a decent research document on them, but so what the research document that I'm going to show you isn't going to tell you it's not going to be like this percentage of cooperatives are producer cooperatives. That's not something I was able to find, but what I was able to find was the proportion of different industries controlled by cooperatives, and what you find is that the the industry with the largest proportion of cooperatives is agricultural, and it's less than 10%, right? And every other region is like structurally much lower percentage controlled by a cooperative ownership than the agricultural industry, because it's an agricultural region, and for some reason, farms and agricultural production seems to lend itself towards producer cooperative structures.
Yeah, that's what I was going to ask you next. Actually, is where are you getting the information that these are dominantly producer co-ops? Because again, I'm not able to see any data on the fact that, because not just because it's an agricultural co-op. I think you're drawing a parallel here between producer co-ops and agriculture that might not necessitate that.
Yeah, like I said,
That being said, because the information that I've grabbed regarding the fact that 2/3 of these people are members of co-ops would indicate to me otherwise, that it tends to be a consumer co-op economy.
Yeah, I think I'm honestly not. I'm not sure. I guess I'd have to look at the data again. My understanding was it's mostly producer cooperatives, but I can send you where I'm getting that from.
Yeah, for sure. I'd love to see that. If you feel free to send me it now or after the debate, whenever. It doesn't matter to me. I'll be sure to look at it for sure, because I'm trying to uncover more information. That being said, though, if it produces 30% of the region's GDP, I think it's important to note for that region, just specifically, farming and agriculture make up about 5.8% of the regional's of the regional gross product.
That is
So
in Emilia Romagna you're talking about?
yeah, Emilia Romagna. You like my Italian accent?
I like it.
Yeah, fiance's Italian, so
Yeah, so
Very well.
it says here in the European context, three different types of cooperatives emerged. Customer-owned cooperatives, which would include consumer co-ops, cooperative banks, and utilities co-ops, worker cooperatives, manufacturing or construction, and producer co-ops in agriculture is the parenthesis there. And I can probably get more of a justification in this thing, the idea that essentially it seems that the agricultural economy is essentially producer cooperatives. Even in America, for instance, that's what I was going to mention, was that there's actually a huge number of, well, I suppose you said it's only 3%, but I think there's actually a pretty large amount. I think there is actually a pretty large amount of producer cooperatives within the agricultural industry in America as well. So that's kind of what I'm getting that off of. So
for me, that doesn't tend to be the case, because I've only seen the large dominant one being Ocean Spray, which might be one of the co-ops in America that has the most employees. But that when we're
maybe
counting the actual amount of raw firms themselves, it only tends to account for about 3% of total firms.
3%
So
of total firms like in the country, or 3% of that 10% of cooperatives?
3% of total of that 10% of cooperatives. Yeah.
Right. Okay. Yeah.
Only about
Those are
7 out
very
of
different statements.
yeah, no, yeah, sorry. I was under the impression that I thought we were just talking about the co-op aspect, that 10% of co-ops, right? There's about 27,000, I believe it is, or 27,500 co-ops in the United States, and 25.5 to 26,000 of them are consumer. 350 or so are worker, and less than 1,000 are each in purchasing and producer. So that seems to be the case with that.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So
So
those are just the raw numbers. I'll cite the source for you. I'll copy the link.
No.
I'll send it where I can. I'm not sure if I have to download the PDF itself. I'll look
No,
into
you're
that
good.
in a minute.
Yeah, I think, and I don't know if we've come to, because it sounds like essentially we may have come to a bit of an impasse here, which is just that basically I am not convinced that these incentives would actually lead to a broadly cooperative or collectivized economy, whereas you might be a little bit more convinced. And the not that socialism as a definition is like a moving target, but obviously I'm sure that you've seen. I'm sure people would listen to this debate. I'm sure people listen to you debate and be like, "Yeah, Dylan's not even like a real socialist, right? Quote unquote, right? for many assorted reasons." And then Synth didn't think that.
On Twitter. I don't really care what they think. Like,
well, yeah,
I'm
but
trying to follow
no,
academic
no,
definition,
I know.
right?
I understand, yeah, but then Synth would call what I am a socialist, which I would disagree for different assorted reasons. But in general, I think it's a bit of an impasse. Obviously, we'll never know. I think all we can do is just say that we probably agree on most prescriptive things, and I guess we'll see if we truly get a socialist economy from there if those prescriptions are implemented. I think that a lot of those prescriptions that you're describing have been implemented in other regions, and we don't see broad collectivization. We see some, but not broad collectivization. And I think that in the society. In the most like open and transparent democratic society that you could be considered most socialist, you might say Norway is that country, but I don't think that they would call themselves socialist. I wouldn't call them socialist by any means, and I think that in a world where, like, I don't know, in a world where their state-owned enterprises represented like a majority of the economy or a majority of like the stock ownership, I still wouldn't call them socialists. And that's the world that we live in today is where a majority of their GDP is based on government spending, right? So collective spending. So Yeah.
Sorry, that's odd to me. I don't understand how you wouldn't see a majority if the majority of the economy was owned by state-owned enterprise. How you wouldn't see that as being socialist. For
Well,
example, I'm not to reference Yugoslavia again. I love to do this though. A majority of their economy was actually state-owned, and when we're talking about previous historical experiments, this one seems to be nothing but an overwhelming success. They were
well,
able to do so
yeah,
much
I
for
may
the
have
people there,
misspoke.
right?
I may have misspoke. Not the whole economy, right? So like if a majority of your entire economy was based on state production and state-owned enterprises, you probably have a more convincing argument for that being quote unquote socialist. But what I would say specifically wasn't because right now a third of their publicly traded essentially equity is owned by the state in one form or another, right? So if that became a majority, I'm not sure I would necessarily call that socialism as well. And in general, it's an esoteric disagreement. That's why, like, sort of finally on that point, if there's another point we can go to it, but like finally on this sort of section of the debate, at least, I would just say that we agree on a lot of the prescriptions. I'm not even sure we disagree on any of the prescriptions. I'm not sure we would call the endpoint socialism, and I'm not sure necessarily the endpoint you're looking for would necessarily be achieved by the same types of incentives that, at least based on what I've seen, have actually been implemented in other places, and they haven't achieved the results that you might hope for in a holistic sense. They've achieved some of those results, but not literally all of them.
So that's where I'm just going to have to come out and disagree with those results, though. I think the largest scale I've pointed to being Yugoslavia was nothing but an overwhelming success. A majority of that economy was cooperatively ran.
Wait, but
Democracy in the
they
workplace and things like that.
but
Points,
Yugoslavia,
failure for me.
Yugoslavia didn't have, as far as I'm aware, maybe I'm wrong on this, they didn't have a robustly democratic government, right? They had a mandated system of collective and cooperative ownership and state enterprise. This is far different from the world that you're advocating for, which is a system of incentivization and voluntary interaction.
So Yugoslavia was a largely democratic society. When it came to how the 8 republics were actually run on a governmental level, every aspect from start to finish of those republics, barring the head of the party being Tito himself, was democratically voted in, right? Now, you can have a head of a party in a nation like Canada, for example, and that
Hold
head of
on,
that
but
party might not democratically be voted in. So
were they democratic in like a real sense, or were they democratic in like a Chinese sense where everyone had to run under the same governing party apparatus, right? Because I feel like while we can say that countries like Cuba and China have like democratic structures, right? I wouldn't say that these are quite open democracies. And it's a genuine question. I'm not sure if the Yugoslavian governments were truly competitive with credible threats of opposition parties, or if everyone just ran under the same party banner and there was like internal competition. Because I think there's a meaningful difference there.
There was a lot of internal competition within the party, and there was, again, it was open and free membership to whoever wanted to run within the party. The party had easy access to the membership of it. It might have been considered a one-party state on that end. Now, there was other political movements that were able to run democratically. They never won, considering the fact that the Yugoslav Communist Party led them, obviously, through revolutionizing Yugoslavia, and they still have 80% favor within people who live in the former republics today. However, all things considered, there was many disagreeing factions within the party itself. You had Milovan Zias, who was a more democratic socialist-leaning type, versus Tito himself, who tended to be a little more authoritarian with the way they wanted the government ran. So it was kind of a varying spectrum. Some of them tended to be more liberal than others. Some of them tended to be a little more authoritative than others. But broadly speaking, it was a very, very democratic and highly democratic society, both within the workplace and within the party itself.
Yeah, but I would disagree with that conception of democracy. Again, we could say that they probably had democratic structures, but I wouldn't call them a robustly democratic society in general, right? If you cannot run an opposition party in a country, I wouldn't call it robustly democratic, right? And what I would also say in that regard is that apparently many countries are able to achieve some form of socialism that you would describe as socialism in a robustly democratic sense. Like you would say Norway might be on that spectrum, a relatively socialist country amongst these sort of Western, imperial core capitalist countries, whatever it might be. My only point would be that if you're using Yugoslavia as an example of like these quote unquote incentives working and actually being able to establish a government of democratic ownership and collectivized ownership, they did not rely on a reformist mindset. Like you said, there was a revolution, there was mandates, right? And this is where
that's the point where I feel like that's historically inaccurate, to the sense that it was a revolutionary society which implemented the party into power. However, there was still privatized land. There was still privatized farms. They had the option of collectivizing. And they actually, a majority of it wasn't owned by the state solely. State had elements of management like any other state has control over a given property or area. However, that
Wait,
being
wait,
said,
but you said earlier in this debate that a majority of the Yugoslav economy was state-owned enterprises. Maybe I misheard, but that seemed to be a statement you made.
oh, sorry, I meant that must have been me misspeaking then, because okay, it's not so much misspeaking. It sounds incorrect because it wasn't mandated state ownership. The state had the option to buy into those enterprises, which it chose to do using the fiscal assets it had on the competing market scale.
So you're telling, well, okay, so you're telling me that if I were to look into this, and perhaps you're completely correct in this regard, if I were to look into this, you're telling me that there was no compulsory ownership or compulsory purchasing done by the Yugoslavian government.
There was some compulsory purchasing, but not to the scale I think you're thinking of. Like, there's certain things owned in other countries, and I don't think that this would constitute like a mass scale state forced compulsory
Well, sure, okay.
ownership.
Let's
So
just
yeah, I feel like that's where what I'm trying to get at here.
Well,
is that
let's
the
just set that aside. Yeah, go on.
Yeah, the state was able to manage a lot of enterprise within that economy through the ability to buy into the product and distribute the product. Because a lot of the time, what they would do is the collective farms themselves would actually produce the crops, and then the state would pay them in turn for that. However, these firms were managed independently. Most of the product itself went to the state in the form of state purchasing it, so they were able to distribute resources across the economy. They had a lot of, again, social programs that were very ahead of its time, which I'm sure some of which you would even agree with me on.
Yeah,
Like
so
they
I
had
think
advanced child care programs and things like that as well.
Well, sure. They also had their own problems, like I mentioned earlier. I was just going to say, let's set that aside. You know, the last 10 or 20 minutes doesn't have to be about whether Yugoslavia was a democracy. It's just to say that that's not the type of that we don't live in a revolutionary like post-revolutionary society in America or in most of the Western world, right? There's never been a revolution in a wealthy liberal democracy, and probably because generally most people are at least relatively satisfied with their day-to-day life. That's not to say that there's not improvements to be done, but we have to work under the current governing apparatus, at least under a reformist framework. And I don't think that the current governing apparatus would, is such that we would be able to see the types of broad reaches of the government into modern civil society in order to get that state ownership component, which is seemingly necessary under your framework. I just don't think that we could. I don't think that we would mandate the types of structures that Yugoslavia did in America, and I'm not sure that we should, because again, you're not arguing for mandates like they did. You're arguing for incentivization, which wasn't purely what the Yugoslavian government did to achieve their quote unquote socialism, right?
Right. That's essentially what I'm trying to do here is I'm trying to extrapolate from the economic data that they had when they implemented these systems in their economy. That's different from the actual pragmatic approach I would take to implementing them in the United States and Canada and Norway today, right? I think these are very different things. So I'm trying to take a pragmatic approach to collectivizing the economy in America, which has been my fundamental point this whole time.
And what I'm saying
to increase that collective effort. I think you'd agree with me on that.
No. And what I'm saying is that more pragmatic and realistic and also just more efficient effort is not the effort that was undertaken by the post-revolutionary Yugoslavian government. That is the effort that you're trying to undertake in America, and that is better than what Yugoslavia did. I would say that, but that is not going to get you to a majority collectivized economy, in my opinion. That's the central claim that I'm making. It doesn't make sense to say, look at all the good things Yugoslavia did, because you're not advocating the mechanisms by which they were able to achieve those things. You're advocating for mechanisms under our current governing frameworks.
Right. So the thing with Yugoslavia, though, is that the outcomes of their economy in and of itself is what I'm advocating for. So I'm sourcing that data to show how these forms of structure and business are effective. That's overall what I'm trying to push for here. Obviously, the mechanisms aren't going to be the same because the historical context leads to very different conclusions in terms of, well, Yugoslavia was a German occupied during World War II monarchist structure where they had 200,000 partisan soldiers camp out in caves until they overtook that governing body at the time. Like that's nothing to do with America in terms of historical context. But all things considered, when we're talking about how their economy was ran, and then eventually the more liberal approaches to their economy when it was the most fruitful in the 70s and the I believe it was 1967 to about 1980 for that. It might have been earlier in the 60s. But just for those 2 decades there, at least, that's what I'm trying to say here. Those are the types of structures I'd like to see implemented. My pragmatic reformist approach might not directly lead to socialism in and of itself, but it is an approach there. And once we source and garner more data on that front, which is the bare minimum goal of implementing the policies I'm trying to implement, then we can actually take it from there and increase the overall ownership within the economy. So I don't see a reason to uh, I think socialism is a slow and gradual process for the most practical way it'll be implemented in America today. That I think that the policy positions I've laid out here and these prescriptions themselves are ones you would agree with. And I've just been trying to demonstrate that the data we have now, at least to go forward with the policy prescriptions I've made, have shown that these type of firms can work on a um, macro level or a federal level throughout the U.S. and Canadian economies, respectively.
I understand. Well, I mean, I guess, like I said, I guess that's all we can really say. I don't have. I feel like I said everything I can with regard to that form of socialism. Yeah. So, did you want to do closing statements, or do you want to just leave it there? Up to you.
Well, to that ends, I have one more question for you. Where are you
All
getting your
right.
definition of socialism? Where have you come up with this notion of socialism you have that would say that Dylan is the fake socialist?
Well, no. I wouldn't call you a fake socialist. I mean, I said that many socialists would probably consider you not a real socialist, but I think that your definition of socialism, where it's collective ownership, is probably reasonable enough. I mean, I think that my discussion with Synth was interesting because I was working under a more, I don't know if it would be called, like, I don't know if you'd consider like a contemporary definition of socialism with worker ownership of the means of production. But I think that debate kind of made me realize, similarly to what I saw Unlearning Economics say in one of his videos, which was that I don't really know if the definition really matters that much, right? I tend to just argue for things that I think would make society better. And if you want to call collective ownership socialism, that might be academically correct. I'm really not sure, but I also don't really care, right? I mean, again, we agree on most of the prescriptions. That most of this debate, which I think was valuable and productive, was just about whether or not those incentivization programs would actually lead to a broad collective ownership, which you would consider socialism. But I don't. It doesn't really matter to me. It's just about like what makes people's lives better and what gives them, relative power over their own, the most positive freedom. Essentially, I think those are the two things I'm most concerned about.
Yeah, so I think the thing that's important to note here is even just with like flat percentiles and things like that, I'm seeking best outcomes. I'd imagine you're a utilitarian yourself in terms of philosophy.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I think the thing that I've tried to lay out here is why my prescriptions fall under a more academic definition of socialism, because that whole contemporary notion of socialism kind of comes from like Richard Wolff and Foch and people like that, right? Who I don't know if they have that sort of historical understanding of where the philosophy itself came from, the early utopian socialists after the French Revolution. But the thing that I'm more broadly getting at here is the policies I'm trying to pass, which it seems you agree with most prescriptions on. I wasn't sure if we'd argue more on this data, and of course, if there's any sources you need to see, just let us know in the group chat. I'll be able to send them to you for the information I've sourced today. I will say though, I think more broadly we're seeking benefit the working class, and the policy prescriptions I've laid out have done a good job of lowering wealth inequality, which I think is one thing I've set out to do. I'm trying to maintain production and growth rates, right? Which are very important when having a stable and fruitful economy. So what I'm trying to get at here is we can do that within this framework while lowering wealth inequality, increasing access to the ownership over means of production, so to speak, and have these collectively ran enterprises. And whether or not you consider that socialist or not, I'm quite happy you agreed with me on my prescriptions. A lot of them are data driven. They're not ideological. I'm not going to try and come out here and moral grandstand you. I'm sure you understand why, collective ownership or whatever, or people having control over their workplace is a good thing. We don't need to have that argument. So I figured I'd just come out here and point to you how there's a pragmatic approach to socialism that can benefit people, can maintain a stable economy, and do a bunch of other good things for society. Because within these, again, just one more thing, just to kind of toot my own horn real quick here.
All right.
Consumer co-ops and worker co-ops tend to do a great job of investing within their own economies and keeping economic resources local, as well as investing in communal projects, which is another good thing about them that I didn't even need to really touch on because we were more so talking about the data, regarding co-ops themselves here, right? And the data regarding their productivity and things like that, which again, I don't think you entirely disagree on. We might have to, I feel like it's important that, because I'm not sure where you get the notion of how co-ops function in specific sectors, because from the data I've collected, they tend to do very well broadly in a lot of different industries, being manufacturing, healthcare,
Yeah.
finance, on top of
Well,
agriculture.
no, but I think so. My point on that would be that if you look at the data on cooperatives, they do tend to do well in a broad set of industries, but that's only if you're collecting a global sample of cooperatives, right? It seems like in some countries, cooperatives do well in certain industries, and in other industries or in other countries, they do well in also certain industries. Typically, when you look at cooperatives, the national samples of cooperatives, you tend to find they sort themselves into certain industries, and the studies thereof tend to find that not all cooperatives do well in all industries, right? That the results are not homogenous might be a phrase that's often used in many of the studies of cooperative ownership, and that's kind of where I'm informing my view that it's better to have cooperatives be incentivized softly so that they organically sort themselves into industries that they do best in, given the country and the time period.
And to that ends, I guess I'd say the data that I have might conflict with that, and I'd like to see some of the data that you have where it says that they do best in individual sectors more so than,
Yeah.
because
Well,
in
you can
recent
you
memory, the
can
data I've been looking at has said that they were good in service, predominantly the worker co-ops that exist in America today, right? And I feel comfortable using those a little bit here to make my point, considering you did talk
yeah
about producer
I
co-ops in agriculture. I think it's safe to say that I hope you're aware that a majority of worker co-ops are in, again, a majority of the employed people work in healthcare in one worker co-op, which has over 2,000 employees.
Yeah,
Um,
I understand. I'm if you're interested in I made a video on worker cooperatives called "Worker Economics of Worker Cooperatives Part 2, and you can always check that out for some of my sources. I don't keep quite a running document. People have asked for it though, so maybe I should. Yeah, you can just check
yeah,
that video out.
that might be a good thing because I would like to see some of your sources. And if you ever do get around to compiling a document, I'd really love to see it. And on that note, Rinald, I think we can move into closing statements if you want.
Yeah, I was thinking that it was about wrapped up. Yeah, if you guys want to do closing statements, I'll let Dylan go first. Just give your overall view of how the conversation went, and then plug whatever you want to plug at the end as well.
Yeah, for sure. So I think me and Econoboy had a really fruitful conversation here. I didn't want to get into any moral grandstanding or anything like that because I think at the end of the day, for me, it comes down to if socialism could be a moral system, then it would have to be productive. And I'm trying to come at that with data on it that agrees with what I've said. So I'm not going to come here. I'm not going to moral grandstand. I think we were able to have a conversation like adults on um, the data itself, the effectiveness of them in the economy, things like that. I really appreciate your charitability and patience with me and my ridiculous Italian accents and things like that. So that is much appreciated. It was pleasant talking to you. As for me, if you're watching this, because you might have uploaded it, Econoboy, at this point, I guess. You can find me at Dylan Blay on Spotify, Dylan Blay _ on Instagram and Twitter, Dylan Blay on YouTube. Um, and yeah, that's where you can find me. Again, great talking to you. It was wonderful finally meeting you, and I'll turn it over to you from there.
Yeah, it was definitely a good talk. I had fun. I would just say, my closing statement, I would just say that, again, I think that some collective ownership probably makes some sense. I think that especially depending on the market, you could argue for state-owned enterprises, again, single-payer healthcare, the military, police, right? There are certain institutions that we might agree are just good for to have state ownership rather than sort of market-oriented distribution of that resource. And even conservatives would agree on certain things, like no. Typically, conservatives don't argue for like the military being privately organized, right? In general, the national military is probably a good thing, and so to that extent, I agree. I think that cooperatives are cool, right? I like cooperatives. I don't think that they're bad. I think consumer cooperatives are an unfortunately underanalyzed thing with regard to most socialist advocates, because if your definition of socialism is collective ownership, then a consumer cooperative would almost certainly fall into that definition for any reasonable person. And so consumer cooperatives have a lot of advantages as well. I don't think there's anything wrong with them. And I don't think there's anything wrong with encouraging them through government policy. My only argument throughout this debate, which I've remained relatively consistent on, is the idea that I'm not sure if under a robustly democratic framework, those incentives would necessarily lead to a truly broadly collectivized society such that Dylan or people like Dylan would consider it socialist. Although I certainly have no problems with cooperatives or anything like that. But yeah, other than that, it was definitely good talking to you, Dylan.
Yeah, for sure. And if you ever want to chat again, I'd be down to chat.
For sure.
Anytime. I'd love to look at any sources you have. I'll be sure to check out that video you mentioned. And with that, I think we're good.